Joshua chapter 10 is the text for today, and the title is Daylight Savings Times. I don't know what week that actually occurs, but hopefully it'll make sense when you see what happens in this text in Joshua chapter 10. So tonight is the Academy Awards. I know none of you will be watching, even if you do, you won't admit it, but those are tonight. And I was wondering, as I looked at this passage and I was aware they were talking about the movies that were nominated and all that kind of thing, and I thought about what if Hollywood decided to make a movie of Joshua chapter 10? I mean, there's plenty of action here for a movie and intrigue. And I thought, if they did and they kept it true to the text, it would have to be rated R for more mature audiences. And it would be because of the overwhelming violence that we find in this passage. It would have to be a big budget film because, the special effects would have to be pretty impressive, with hail big enough to destroy armies and the sun and the moon standing still in the sky. So I thought about it. I spent way too much time on it, trying to think of if a movie was made of Joshua 10, what would the title of the movie be? I came up with some possibilities. The Day the Earth Stood Still, starring, I thought maybe Chuck Norris would be a good Joshua in that film. The Longest Day, starring John Wayne as Joshua, a truly American version of Joshua 10. How about Hail on Earth? H-A-I-L, Hail on Earth. Boy, that 815 was really with me on this. How about this one? Good Israelite Fellows. Okay. I see I got into this century. Well, no, that was actually last century probably, but I got close anyway. Yeah, maybe Ray Liotta as Joshua in that one. How about God the Father rather than the Godfather? Maybe Marlon Brando as Joshua. How about The Passion of the Israelites or Brave Hearts, plural, Mel Gibson? Canaanite Chariots of Fire. I didn't have anybody in mind for that one. And then Miracle of Ice. Hail, not Miracle on Ice. Thanks a lot. But despite the overwhelming violence, despite the big budget for the special effects, this film would have to have heart. It would have to offer more hope and inspiration than It's a Wonderful Life, or Rudy, or Hoosiers. Let's see what the text says for us. It's Joshua chapter 10, starting in verses 1 through 5, the shifting balance of power. Now, King Adonai-Zedek of Jerusalem heard that Joshua had captured Ai and completely destroyed it, treating Ai and its king as he had Jericho and its king, and the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were living among them. So Adonai-Zedek and his people were greatly alarmed because Gibeon was a large city, like one of the royal cities. It was larger than Ai, and all its men were warriors. Therefore, King Adonai-Zedek of Jerusalem sent to King Hoham of Hebron, King Piram of Jarmuth, King Japhia of Lachish, and King Debir of Eglon, saying, "Come up and help me. We will attack Gibeon because they've made peace with Joshua and the Israelites." So the 5 Amorite kings, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, joined forces, advanced with all their armies, besieged Gibeon, and fought against it. Newton's third law of motion certainly applies here in Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That law applies here. The king of Jerusalem, Adonai-Zedek, has observed, 1, that the Israelites had defeated Ai and completely destroyed it. That was chapter 8. He also remembered that they did the same thing to Jericho. That's chapter 6. So seeing the destruction that the Israelites are bringing to Canaan and to its kings and to the people who live there, he has grave concern. But now something new has happened. The Gibeonites, who are part of Canaan, have made a peace treaty with the Israelites. Remember last week, that was the peace treaty that Joshua, without seeking the Lord's direction, made with the Gibeonites. And so now, the kings of the Amorite kings, led by Adonizedek, see that they even have some among their own people who are joining with the Israelites to fight with them rather than against them. And all of this shifts the balance of power in Canaan. And so for Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, the only thing he thinks gives them any hope at all would be an alliance of 4 other kings and their people to bring these 5 Amorite kings together to battle the Israelites and the Gibeonites. Adonizedek, the leader of the alliance, is an interesting figure, if for no other reason, by his name and where he is king. The name Adonizedek, Adonai means Lord, and Zedek means righteousness. So his name is Lord of Righteousness, or my Lord of Righteousness, and he is king of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem means city of peace. And so he's an interesting character because he's not righteous and he's not seeking peace. And yet he is Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem. He opposes God's people and God's purposes. The king also calls to mind a figure about 400 years earlier who was king of the same city. His name is Melchizedek. Do you hear Adonizedek and Melchizedek? That Zedek part means righteousness. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. He makes an appearance in Genesis chapter 14. Abraham has gone to war to defeat an alliance of 4 kings who are threatening Lot, his nephew. So he goes to war, he defeats the 4 kings, and then he goes to the priest, who's also the king of Jerusalem, Melchizedek, and he pays him a tithe. And that's it. He just shows up in a couple of verses there in Genesis 14. He does show up in one passage in the Psalms, Psalms 110:4, and you shall be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And then he suddenly becomes a crucial figure in the book of Hebrews when the author of Hebrews argues that Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek and not in the order of Aaron. I mean, Jesus is not from the tribe to be a priest. He's from Judah. So his priesthood is in the order of Melchizedek, whose name means king of righteousness, who is king of Salem, his name, and he is king of Salem, which means king of peace. It's an early form of the city Jerusalem. So it's an interesting connection between Adonizedek and Melchizedek, 400 years apart, kings in the same city. I would say Melchizedek is a Christ figure. The writer of Hebrews makes that so. Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Adonizedek is an antichrist figure. Not that he is the antichrist, but he is opposing God's people and God's purposes. And so he calls together an alliance. And so there are 5 Amorite kings who are going to attack Gibeon. Section 2, hail on earth, Hail, and the sun stands still. Look at verse 6. Then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, don't give up on your servants, come quickly and save us, help us, for all the Amorite kings living in the hill country have joined forces against us. So Joshua and all his troops, including all his best soldiers, came from Gilgal. The Lord said to Joshua, don't be afraid of them. I have handed them over to you. Not one of them will be able to stand against you. So Joshua caught them by surprise after marching all night from Gilgal. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel. He defeated them in great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them through the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. As they fled before Israel, the Lord threw large hailstones on them from the sky along the descent of Beth Horon all the way to Azekah, and they died. More of them died from the hail than the Israelites killed with the sword. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the presence of all Israel. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon, stand still over the valley of Ajalon. And the sun did stand still, and the moon did stop until the nation took vengeance on its enemies. Isn't this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed its setting almost a day. There has been no day like it before or since when the Lord listened to a man, because the Lord fought for Israel. And then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. At this point, the Israelites are not under attack. The Gibeonites are under attack. The 5 kings of the Amorites decide to attack Gibeon because of their treacherous ways, because they had betrayed them and made a peace treaty with the Israelites. But now the Israelites are duty bound by their peace treaty to lend military assistance to the cities of Gibeon. I mean, that peace treaty that Joshua had made with them is the gift that just keeps on giving. So now when they attack Gibeon, the Israelites are duty bound to show up and fight on their behalf. It's interesting that when he calls for Joshua to come and save us, Joshua's name means Yahweh saves. So to the one whose name means Yahweh saves, the Gibeonites call out, "Come save us." And of course, the Israelites are bound to respond. For the second time in Joshua, the first time was Joshua chapter 8, verse 1. You can go back there when they were about to take Ai. The Lord said to Joshua, "Don't be afraid or discouraged. Take all the troops with you and go attack Ai. Look, I have handed over to you the king, the people, the city, and the land. So do not be afraid. I've already given you the victory." And now, in 10:8, the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for I have handed them over to you. Not one of them will be able to stand against you." So here is the promise. You're going to win, so there's no need to be afraid. And so Joshua heads out with his military. Potentially 30,000 troops are marching now, the 15 to 20 mile trek between Gilgal, where they're camped, and the cities of Gibeon. And he gets there in record time. In fact, they march all through the night. And when they arrive, it's such a surprise to the 5 Amorite kings that they're shocked, they're stunned. So this happens as a result of the speedy way in which they had traveled. But isn't it interesting what follows? Joshua caught them, verse 9, by surprise by marching all night from Gilgal. Verse 10, the Lord threw them, that is the cities of the Amorites, into confusion before Israel. Now look at the next word. He defeated them in a great slaughter at Gibeon. Who defeated them? It could be Joshua, because he caused the troops to arrive, marched all night. That threw them into confusion. But the text clearly says the Lord threw them into confusion, so the he could be Yahweh. Who is it that defeated them in the great slaughter at Gibeon? Was it Joshua and the Israelite troops, or was it Yahweh? And the answer is both. Yahweh doesn't just rain down hailstones and destroy all the armies. He uses Joshua and the Israelites, who got there in record time. And the people were astounded, and it confused them that they'd arrived so quickly to fight for the Gibeonites. And yet, the text says, the Lord threw them into confusion. It's a perfect example of what so often happens in the world, in our lives. If we are able to overcome, if God gives us victory in some way, it's often in this compatibilism or this synergy between divine agency and human activity. And where we get in trouble is where we only see the human activity and we think we won because of us and us alone. And we often miss the unseen hand of God that is at work in that event. Maybe using your sword, maybe using your Bible, maybe using whatever instrument he calls you to use, but it is the unseen hand of God that is also at work through your action, through your obedience. I mean, most of the victories you'll find in life don't happen because you just sit down and wait and do nothing. Obedience to God, and God uses our obedience often in order to bring about the outcome that we hope for, pray for, and certainly that is part of God's purposes. Now let me caution you, I am not saying here today that God helps those who help themselves. That's not a good biblical principle, I do not believe. I'm not saying God helps those who help themselves. I'm saying God's purposes will come to fulfillment. And in this case, God's purpose is for Israel to be redeemed and resting in this land. And God's going to do it, but He's going to give Israel the opportunity to participate in bringing it about. God is giving the Israelites the possibility, the opportunity to participate in His purposes of putting this people in this land. It's not God helping the Israelites because they're helping themselves. It's their obedience to God. He's allowing them to participate in bringing about His purposes. And that's how you're going to overcome in your life. By recognizing that you can't do it alone, but God might use your obedience to bring it about. And that line between divine agency and human activity is often impossible to discern. In fact, in this moment, it's not easy to know who the He is there at the beginning or in verse 10. He defeated them at the great slaughter at Gibeon. Is that Yahweh? Yes. Is it Joshua and the Israelites? Yes. And that's where we live our lives as well. Don't ever lose sight of what is often the unseen hand of God. If you do, you'll claim all the credit. Victory over the 5 kings comes about by Israelite sword, but also by cosmic forces. Did you catch this hailstorm? Verse 11, as they fled before Israel, the Lord threw large hailstones on them from the sky, and they died. And more died from the hail than the Israelites killed with the sword. Now, I can't imagine people living anywhere else in the world being able to understand this better than you. We are Oklahomans. Every spring, and we're moving into it, even now we have broached March, we've crossed that boundary. So you know what's coming. David Payne or whoever you watch for the weather is going to be your constant companion over the next couple of months. And whatever show you're interested in watching on TV, if it's a local telecast, you're going to have to see the warnings on the screen as well. I've learned since I moved to Oklahoma, watching the NCAA basketball tournament involves dodging the weather reports through the whole tournament because it's March. But can you imagine hail like this? I mean, what kind of state of mind would David Payne be in if hail the size of boulders was falling outside? He would absolutely wear himself out. And that's what happens here. And you know when hail like that's falling from the sky that cosmic forces are fighting against you. If you're the 5 kings of the Amorites and those Amorite troops, at that point you're losing anyway. You know it's over. I don't know how you find the motivation to take another step. Cosmic forces are fighting against you. It sounds like what God said to Job in 38, 22, and 23. God says to Job, this is part of Job complaining about, God not answering his questions, and God's kind of giving it to him a little bit. And he says, have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? Well, those 5 Amorite kings are seeing the storehouse of God's hail, and it has rained down on them. And now it's Joshua's turn to act. So look at verse 12. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the presence of Israel. So this looks like a prayer. But the words he uttered, it's an imperative. It's like he's commanding in the prayer. Sun, stand still over Gibeon. Moon, stand still over the valley of Ajalon. It's an unusual kind of prayer. It's almost like he's directing God to increase his cosmic activity and to extend the length of the day so they can go ahead and wipe out all the Amorites on this day. I mean, the longer the daylight, the more that they can slaughter. And shockingly, God answers his prayer to the point that in verse 14, the text says, there has been no day like it before or since when the Lord listened to a man, because the Lord fought for Israel. He responded to Joshua's request before all Israel. Sun, stand still. Moon, stand still. And it did. It's almost like in that moment there was a reversal. Yahweh and Joshua sort of reverse roles for a moment. Yahweh fights and pursues the enemies. Joshua stops the sun and the moon, commands it so. Once again, it's seeing divine agency and human activity so interrelated that it's difficult to know which is more at work. And the answer is, in this moment, both. And the result is the absolute, utter defeat of these 5 Amorite nations. The sun and moon standing still is the language of observation. It's not a scientific declaration. I mean, you're aware, until the 1500s, most of the world that I'm aware of thought of the universe in which we live as geocentric. That is, the earth is the center, and whatever movement goes on with the constellations involving the sun, they were orbiting the earth. But Copernicus, although he did not have a telescope, he had a steel tube and he could make some measurements. He was able to discern that it's quite the opposite, that we live in a heliocentric universe with the sun as the center and the earth and the planets orbit around it. But when you look up, we say things like, we do this today. We're not making a scientific declaration when we say the sun rises or the sun sets. You know the sun doesn't rise. You know the sun doesn't set. It looks that way to observation because the sun is in place and we're orbiting around it and we're spinning. And so when we turn to the sun, it looks like the sun is rising. As we turn away, it looks like it's setting. I've never had anybody say to me, if I said, did you see the sunset? Well, the sun didn't set. You're not very scientifically minded. We speak in observational ways, and that's what the text is doing here. He's asking for the sun to stand still, that is, for the day to be extended. It would look like the sun stands still. Now, what exactly happened scientifically? Well, I can't tell you. Maybe the earth stood still, literally. However God did it, the point of the text is cosmic forces directed by God are working on behalf of the Israelites. God's like that. He has that kind of power. It's beyond comprehension. And so the Israelites win. There are other texts that speak of God's ability to control cosmic forces. Hezekiah was going to die. King Hezekiah was going to die in Isaiah 38. He was terminally ill. And Isaiah the prophet tells him, get your affairs in order. It's just about over for you. And he prays. And God tells him that he's going to give him 15 more years. And as a sign that he's going to do that, Isaiah 38:8 says, I am going to make the sun's shadow that goes down on the stairway of Ahaz go back 10 steps. 10 steps. Do you know what that is? That's reversing time. You can't do that. Oh boy, if we could. How many times would you have, you're sitting there with your remote control and you miss something, you go back 30 seconds. How many times would you reverse time in your life if you could have? Take me back 30 seconds so I didn't say what I just said. Or I didn't do what I just did. Well, if you're looking for something that separates human beings from God, here's one. We can't reverse time. At least I'm not aware of time travel. But I know God can reverse time. He controls the cosmic forces. That's the point of Isaiah 38. Habakkuk 3:11, with Joshua 10 surely in mind, says, God can make the sun and moon stand still. Whatever we make of it, God's power is beyond human comprehension. And then finally, 5 kings cowering in a cave. Starting at verse 16. Now the 5 defeated kings had fled and hidden in the cave at Makkedah. Their troops, their peoples are still out fighting. The kings have run to attempt to escape, and they're hiding in a cave. It was reported to Joshua, the 5 kings have been found. They're hiding in the cave at Makkedah. And Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and station men by it to guard the kings. But as for the rest of you, don't stay there. Pursue your enemies, attack them from behind. Don't let them enter the cities, for the Lord your God has handed them over to you. So Joshua and the Israelites finished inflicting a terrible slaughter on them until they were destroyed. But now, don't miss this picture. You have 5 kings who believe themselves to be the rightful kings of Canaan, the promised land. But they are false kings. There is only one king in the promised land. So these 5 kings hide in a cave. When Joshua becomes aware, he has large stones rolled over the cave and guards placed there to protect it. Does that sound the least bit familiar? I'm trying to get you to look for Jesus in the Old Testament. Look for types and fulfillments of that type, or echoes from what we know of Jesus back into the Old Testament. See how the Old Testament is hidden, or the New Testament is hidden in the Old Testament. Here are these 5 false kings in a tomb with a stone rolled over it with guards guarding the tomb. They hope it's not a tomb, but it's going to become a tomb. It sounds like Matthew 27, 65 and 66, where the report goes out in Matthew related to another king. Take guards, Pilate told them. Go and make it as secure as you know how. And they went and secured the tomb by setting a seal on the stone and placing the guards there. And then the Israelites continued their slaughter of the Amorites until there was no threat left. And then Joshua returned to the cave. Look at verse 21. The people returned safely to Joshua and the camp at Makkedah, and no one dared to threaten the Israelites. Then Joshua said, open the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me out of there. And that's what they did. They brought the 5 kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon to Joshua out of the cave. And when they brought the kings to him, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the military commanders who had accompanied him, come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings. So the commanders came forward and put their feet on their necks. And Joshua said to them, do not be afraid or discouraged. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord will do this to all the enemies you fight. You don't have to fear them. Look, your foot is on their neck. And you don't have to fear anyone else in Canaan because God is giving it to you. It's a picture of authority and of the impotence and weakness of these false kings. You don't have to be afraid of them, and you don't have to fear your enemies now. In the New Testament, we are told that God is going to put all of Jesus' enemies under his feet like a footstool. The picture there is of Jesus' foot on the neck of all the evil and demonic forces and evil spirits and those who reject God and his purposes. All his enemies as his footstool. And because of that, you don't have to fear them either. And now look what happens. Verse 26, after this, Joshua struck them down and executed them. He hung their bodies on 5 trees, and they were there until evening. At sunset, Joshua commanded that they be taken down from the trees and thrown into the cave where they had hidden. Then large stones were placed against the mouth of the cave, and the stones are still there to this day. And guess what else is still there to this day? The remains of those 5 false kings. You get the picture? There's going to be another king who is going to hang on a tree, but he is the one true king. And he's going to be placed into a tomb and a large rock rolled over it, but he's going to come alive and roll that stone away. I don't know if you've heard, but his tomb is empty. And so in a few weeks, we'll say something like, he is risen, and you'll say, but you'll be more in the Easter spirit, so you'll be more enthusiastic. It'll be more like this, he is risen. He is risen indeed. But not these 5 false kings. Joshua makes it clear. Those large stones were placed against the mouth of the cave, and the stones are still there today. And Jesus has placed his foot on the head and crushed the head of the one great enemy of God and his purposes, just like Genesis 3:15 promised. Going all the way back to the beginning. We have nothing to fear because he's alive.